Okay, thank you everyone for having me, and thank you, Sam. My name's Isabella, and I'm going to be discussing what I'm calling the PetroVampiric, the oil industry, technology, America and its borders, and relationships with the rest of the world. This paper began as my undergrad dissertation, but like a vampire, it won't stay dead. So I welcome any feedback or suggestions for what this could become in the future. Okay, so film is vampiric. It penetrates binaries of life and death, reality and fiction, science and the supernatural. The shadows of performers, some already dead, are naturally preserved for our pleasure. The legendary film critic Laura Mulvey drew on the cinema's gothic nature for her book Death 24 Times a Second, where she argued that every frame, every still image, was in effect a death, a killing of mobile reality, but that the collation of these frames into a motion picture was an illusion that reanimated each frame into a technological uncanny. She associates the cinema with the figure of the ghost and Victorian phantasmagoria shows, but I think of it as more vampiric. Films are engaged with the corporeal, bodies in the audience and bodies on screen. Vampirism is in the very materiality of film itself. Our oldest surviving photograph used bitumen, petroleum tar, and this was fundamental to the invention of celluloid film strips. Oil as fuel was also necessary for transporting all the bulky machinery of filmmaking. It's a compelling idea. The energy of once living organisms prevented from decomposition, remobilized as fossil fuels to permeate the boundary between the animate and inanimate. In a recent essay, Madeleine Lee Madigar proposed the term petromonstrosity to describe the monstrous and gothic ways we think about and discuss oil. And I'd like to advance the vampire as the monster of petroculture. The machinery of oil, its pumps and pipelines, penetrate the earth and extract its lifeblood. Its effects are so pervasive that it collapses time. Its origins stretch far into prehistory, and its impact on our environment and society increases exponentially into the future. The effects of the oil industry are hypervisible, even while its messy workings are concealed offshore and underground. The intertwined histories of petroleum and cinema have shaped consumer culture and global commodity chains, which are embroiled in imperialism, and this lends itself to the parasitic power dynamic implied by the metaphor of the vampire. I'm focusing on vampire films that engage with their own materiality, that engage with oil extraction and consumption with the petrovampiric. So, Karl Marx used the vampire as metaphor in Capital to critique capitalistic exploitation of workers. He wrote, "Capital is dead labour, which, vampire-like, lives only by sucking living labour, and lives the more labour it sucks." Workers become incorporated into the automaton of capitalist production, which he figures as a monstrous chimera of machine and organism. What Marx seems to find most unsettling is that the capitalist machine is made to seem alive. The scholar Rob Latham argues that this is an ambivalent figure, incorporating technological progress with the gothic horror of exploitation into a vampire cyborg. And in the essay, A Cyborg Manifesto, Donna Haraway theorizes our society and bodies under increasing militarization, global capitalism, and technological progress as cyborgs, as the illegitimate children of a border war. However, she states that the cyborg is unfaithful to its militaristic and capitalist origins and can be used to imagine utopian futures. The vampire cyborg is a complex figure that we can use to critique economic and social inequality, capitalism, and the exploitation of nature. I focus on films that portray technologically penetrated landscapes and technologically constituted vampires and how they embody the petrovampiric. I also wanted to focus specifically on transnational films, as technology allows the industry to become increasingly so. Many vampire narratives have been concerned with border crossings, the punctured border of bitten skin tied to national borders, reflecting racist anxieties about contamination of blood and disruption of identity. I'm interested in how transnational vampire cinema that emerges from borderlands, can reflect on the alienation of displaced populations and the community forged in contested territories. I turn to Chris Berry's definition of transnational cinema as a new cinematic order that reflects neoliberalism, free trade, the collapse of socialism, and post-Fordist production. to emphasize that these are not only films that cross and complicate national borders, but are entrenched in post-industrial, globalized forms of production. In Borderlands, Gloria Anzaldúa writes of the interstitial space between nations as an open wound of cultural abrasions that bleed together into a new border culture of deviance and possibility. The figure of the vampire is a borderland creature. Between humanity and monstrosity, life and death, Anzaldúa maps a permeable landscape onto the bodies of its inhabitants, who are both vampiric, monstrous, isolated, forbidden, and vampirized, physically penetrated, exploited. The films I'll be discussing today scrape against the first world country par excellence, the United States, the largest consumer of oil in the world. So first we're going to travel north to Canada, and then south to Mexico, and then to borders bled by diaspora, punctured by the US and the Middle East's shared history of petroleum extraction and the sticky geopolitical implications of that industry. The films themselves are cyborgian blends of human labor with technology to create the on-screen vampire. While products of a transnational capitalist industry, these films reflexively sink their teeth into exploitation in the borderlands. Once struck, extracted, distilled, the vampire cyborg is essential for understanding cinema and society. So, in David Cronenberg's Rabid, the body is a site of internal contradictions. After she's involved in a motorbike crash, a young woman named Rose is rushed to a nearby plastic surgery clinic. The experimental skin grafts she receives go horribly wrong, and she develops a blood-sucking proboscis. She involuntarily feeds off those she comes across as she flees the clinic, but each of her victims are transformed into zombies, and the Montreal setting is transformed into a terror zone. The film deliberately and overtly references the October Crisis of 1970. The Canadian government invokes the War Measures Act to root out the cancer in response to the actions of the Front de Libération de Québec, a Marxist and Quebec separatist group. This association of colonial power and independence movements with physical bodies and unruly or terrorist cells was drawn by Cronenberg himself. He said, "I don't think that the flesh is necessarily treacherous, evil, bad. It's cantankerous and it's independent. It really is like colonialism. The colonies suddenly decide that they can and should exist within their own personality and should detach from the control of the mother country." Justin D. Edwards, no relation, called this a body politic horror, combining fears of violated bodily and territorial boundaries and a fear of being subsumed into commoditization, technoscience, hegemony, and empire. Rabid's treatment of this is multivalent, seeing a colonized body involuntarily acting a kind of colonization on the city. Quebec in the 60s and 70s saw a period of socio-political reform towards modernization in service to the demands of capital. The prioritization of capital over human lives is revealed through ambivalent symbols of PetroVampiric technology. As the city descends into chaos, officials from the Quebec Bureau of Health sit in a car approaching a construction site, discussing the city as a complex machine. As their road is blocked by zombified workers, we get a close-up of a drill bit penetrating the car door, which reads City of Montreal, and coming out bloodied. The city itself is punctured and bled by the vampiric, cyborgian demands of capitalism, yet the worker can use the same vampire cyborg tool to attack the class hierarchy suggested by the inside-outside binary of the car. The exploitation of human bodies and labor is linked to oil-consuming vehicles. Modernization also serves to alienate Indigenous people from their land, a part of Canada's colonization that goes overlooked. We're given a brief glimpse of two Indigenous men detained at the police station, where one is being breathalyzed. Indigenous people in North America are some of the most threatened by the petroleum industry, as pipelines penetrate and pollute their land. Machinery and mobility are even more limited for these men, whose presence is fleeting, yet reminds the viewer of the spectre of Canada's colonial past and present. So, one of Cronenberg's first commercial films, Rabid grapples with the perceived Americanness of the film industry, which he called the big movie machine. The opening credits intercut between Rose and her boyfriend riding the motorcycle and the plastic surgery clinic staff discussing the potential franchisement of their company, which one describes as unnatural, magnificent, and inevitable. The lead doctor's response is characteristic of a Canadian rejection of American capitalism. "I just sure as hell don't want to become the Colonel Sanders of plastic surgery." This parallels Cronenberg's simultaneous resistance to and acceptance of the inevitable consumerization of his work. The film's central premise that a supposedly neutralized skin graft conceals dangerous internal contradictions is analogous to Canada itself. Beside the turbulent world power of the US, Canada's apparent neutrality seems to be its defining feature. Rose's boyfriend, Hart, spends much of the film restricted by his technological failure and his passivity. His lack of independent mobility is contrasted with American freedom. He futilely tinkers with his destroyed bike while promotional stills from Easy Rider loom in the background. Ira Livingston parallels the film's interest in technology and the technology of film itself, the double-double reel of the motorcycle movie projector. The technology on screen is conjoined with technology off screen, with a camera mounted onto the motorbike. The cyborg body is unstable, however, as the crash and subsequent perforation of Rose's body augurs her vampiric transformation. The technology of film itself is vampiric, a product of capitalism that subsists on human bodies, yet is equally a tool for interrogating Canada's national narratives. So, in Guillermo del Toro's Kronos, kindly grandfather and antique shop owner Jesus finds an insect-like device which attaches to his skin, granting him youth and a thirst for blood. As anticipated the implementation of the North American Free Trade Agreement in 1992, Mexico was a nation threatened by the colossus of its northern neighbor. This transnational accord was part of a wider movement in the 80s and 90s towards neoliberalism, deregulation of capital, and post-Fordist production, which provoked an influx of vampire media. Del Toro set his first feature 2 years in the future in a post-NAFTA world, so he was anticipating what the world might look like post-NAFTA. He depicts this relationship between the US and Mexico as vampiric, but never portrays this as a black and white morality tale, with leading role Jesus Grey Jesus, as a reluctant vampire. Hunting for the Kronos device are aging businessman Dieter de la Guardia and his nephew Angel. Dieter lives in an attic chamber above his mysterious factory, emblematic of the vertical hierarchy of capitalism. He surrounds himself with mass-produced archangel statues hanging from chains. The plastic bag suggests the unnaturally preserved vampire body, unsustainable accumulation, and the PetroVampiric extraction of oil necessary to fabricate them. The hanging angels mirror the hanging corpse at the start of the film, drawing a parallel between LaGuardia and the Spanish alchemist vampire who built the Kronos device to show the continuity of capitalism back to imperialist colonization. This exposes the human cost within modern capitalism and the commodification of human bodies. It harkens to Marx's blend of technological progress and primitive horror in the metaphor of the vampire. Del Toro noted that he wanted to depict NAFTA as the biggest form of vampirism, but included many examples of exploitation, down to the insect inside the device. Del Toro parallels the LaGuardia factory with interior shots of the Kronos device, both cramped with unexplained and intimidating metal machinery, entrapping the organic elements of the workers and the insect. The device, which affixes to Jesus, transforming him into a vampire cyborg, is itself a cyborgian mesh of machine and flesh. The film reveals layers of suffering within modern global capitalism and its genealogy of colonialism. The film reflects Latham's reading of our society of consumption that punctures and drains us, creating a psychic wound that compels individuals to enact the vampirism they have themselves undergone. Del Toro depicts post-NAFTA Mexico City as vulnerable to American violence. The American, Angel, is the most mobile character. His comparative youth and wellness, and his access to a car, facilitate his free movement throughout the space. The PetroVampiric technology of the film is used to emphasize the exploitative nature of the capitalist machine. Diasporic Iranian-American director Anna Lily Amirpour set A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night in a liminal space between nations. A mysterious vampire girl stalks the streets of Bad City, a town in the shadow of the petroleum industry where the alienated populace exploit one another. It is set in Iran but filmed in Taft, California, a town built entirely on the oil and gas industry. The oil fields that puncture both settings form a techno-borderland, both countries conjoined by a shared landscape. In Petrofiction, the oil encounter in the novel, Amitav Ghosh reflects on the inability of the novel to coherently pass petroleum's power, polluting effects, and the tense transnational entanglements between America and the Arab world. The novel, he argues, as a primarily national monolingual form that benefits from a sense of place, is ill-equipped to strike oil in its intrinsically displaced, heterogeneous, and international world. Film, with its potential to defamiliarize space and its more transnational production and reception, can better express this friction in petrofiction. Graham MacDonald builds on Ghosh's work, advancing that oil's invisibility within American cultural production is increasingly contrasted with the visibility of its effect in the world. This balance between invisibility and obvious threat is embodied by the vampire, and particularly notable here as Amirpour plays with the threat that Middle Eastern oil-producing companies pose to American national anxieties. Drained bodies cut to shots of fang-like pump jacks penetrating the ground, and the film's narrative. It's an industrial wasteland dominated by oil tanks, their imposition on the landscape emphasized by the widescreen framing. Amirpour emphasizes the looming PetroVampiric monstrosity of the oil field right at the beginning of the film, gesturing towards exploitation within Iran, exploitation of the oil-rich Middle East and North Africa by the US, and capitalist exploitation globally. Concluding the opening sequence, a close-up of barren branches racks into a long shot of the oil field, reminding us of the artifice of film, how our attentions can be directed and misdirected. It reveals the extractive industry behind the desolation of the setting with a self-consciously filmic shot. The technologies of oil and film spill out into the frame, forcing the viewer to confront the complexity and violence of the oil encounter. A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night revamps the genre film, pastiching the spaghetti western with what Frederick Jameson called a cannibalization of all the styles of the past. But Hollywood westerns were already inauthentic representations of the American frontier, and these myths proliferated through various cultural and generic hybrids and fed back into American national identity. Amirpour extracts from the dead genre of the western. The cold landscape of the oil field offers a foreign environment for this undead genre, an illusion of Iranian and American setting. It alienates all viewers. The Hollywood western is a borderland genre, the frontiers of American myth-making imperiled by oil's transformation of the landscape. The girl is haunted by a dream of leading man Arash silhouetted in a corridor, styled after the doorway shots from The Searchers. John Ford's doorway represents an America on the brink, faced with encroaching modernity and the erosion of American origin myths. Amirpour stretches the liminal doorway space into a dark tunnel, a borderland between genres and countries. And the genre is suffused with tension between the wilderness and encroaching modernity. Stacey Abbott looks to vampire road movies such as Catherine Bigelow's Near Dark as an overlapping frontier with the Western. She writes, "The vampire film uses the iconography of both genres to reimagine the vampire through the language of modernization." Borderlands explores a similar tension between natural vistas and modern technology. The landscape shaped by cars corporealized the gouged and amputated body. The American classic car in A Girl Walks Home Alone at Night leans into this ambivalence. It's the character's escape from Bad City, yet it consumes the oil that shapes the alienation of their lives. It ties them to the technology of civilization, particularly American civilization. By revealing the scarred landscape of oil extraction, the seduction of oil consumption is demystified. The characters are unable to divest from it entirely, but must reevaluate the complex morals of their position. Arash brings the girl, the vampire, in his flight before coming to the realization of her involvement in his father's death. This causes him to stop the car and reconsider. His ultimate decision to continue driving is dialectical. Haraway stresses the need for plural perspectives, where the cyborg simultaneously augurs apocalyptic and utopian visions. She argues for pleasure in the confusion of boundaries and for responsibility in their construction. The film's conclusion unites vampire, human, cat, and car. This moment of mechanical stillness and reanimation echoes Mulvey's description of film technology itself, their continued motion, a technological undeath. Amirpour creates a vampire cyborg gesturing towards futurity, while still accounting for the violence that lies underneath these extractive industries. The technology of film is mobilized to critique our culture industry, despite paradoxically being its product. Finally, I just want to mention Interview with the Vampire AMC, the TV show, because I love it, but also because it transplants the setting of the original book and film into modern-day Dubai. This is a city founded on oil money, a playground for the very rich, like the vampire characters of the TV series. They're multimillionaires, art dealers, landlords, hyper-capitalists. The series' title card depicts the skyline of its settings. The highly recognizable silhouette of the Burj Khalifa becomes a fang and explicitly ties the setting to vampirism. Dubai has financially benefited from political instability elsewhere in the Middle East, in part manufactured by the US to disrupt the oil trade of OPEC. Interview with the Vampire employs transnational petrovampiric ideas, showing that these themes are only increasingly relevant as the wealth gap widens and the effects of the climate crisis become ever more pressing. Mobilizing the vampire cyborg as a metaphor for film reveals its ability to both uphold and penetrate transnational capitalist hegemony. Films that engage with the petrovampiric expose the machinery underpinning the medium. As Mulvey reminds us, rather than killing the cinema, new technologies bring it new life. Or perhaps it's an afterlife. The rise of digital filmmaking and distribution has opened up the bodies of films, placing the power over the life and death of the image in the hands of the viewer. This drives my own practice of criticism, obsessively rewatching, extracting stills, distilling meaning. Film writing has become inextricable from digital technology. This craft is vampiric. Mulvey tells us that by fragmenting film this way, we're wounding it. But from this wound spills new interpretations, a reanimated vampire cyborg, synthesis of the carnal and the machine, seductive and menacing. In the open wound of the borderlands, the open wound that, in an era of transnational capitalism, grows wider, hungrier, we can turn our own vampiric practices as critics, artists, theorists, and viewers back to reflect and create anew. Thank you very much for listening.